On March the 3rd, I set off from Waterloo Station with Stewart Home to visit New Malden. The suburb is both a childhood haunt of Holmes he's been keen to revisit, and the home of a shadowy figure, James Lee Richardson, that he wanted to research. Lee Richardson, who also went by the names James Lee and Desmond Dunn, was a central figure in introducing yoga to the UK in the 1950s. At our first stop on the Malden Road, a building on this site called Insight House was Lee Richardson's first yoga headquarters. We inspected it, but there was no evidence of its previous incarnation, save perhaps from the building's faintly occult-sounding name.
As a kid, I had an auntie who lived in New Malden and used to come here a lot because it was the closest relative to where I was growing up. I didn't realise for years, but New Malden was the kind of a yoga and occult centre of the universe in the kind of 1950s.
Stewart Home is a celebrated cult author of some 27 books, both non-fiction and fictional. His route into yoga was unorthodox. A first-time author had asked Home whether reading at public events was difficult. His reply had been that it was so easy he could do it standing on his head. But why leave it at that? He had already been reciting his work from memory and had been incorporating ventriloquism. The need to accomplish this task led him to encounter yoga.
I'll go and learn how to stand on my head and then do readings standing on my head. I'd have been happy to do a gymnastics class. And as it turned out, when I went to the yoga class, they taught me a basket headstand, which is like this. The more gymnastic one is a tripod like that, which I find superior and is what I use now. But, I just needed to learn to stand on my head. But at the same time, the yoga instructors would tell you all this stuff about, we're going to align your chakras today. It's like, oh, come on. You've been reading The Serpent Power by Arthur Avalon or some such nonsense. You don't actually believe that, do you? Actually, I know a lot of people who do. But, I became quite critical of what was going on because I actually felt some of the exercise wasn't safe because I did quite a lot of other exercise and I was interested in sports science. So, everything from a full neck roll through to, a lot of the back bending wasn't necessarily good for you. You had to be careful. It could have a wearing effect on the spinal discs in the long term. And then one day I was looking at the Observer, I think it was, and there was a piece about America First, but it had a picture of a guy called Eric in a kind of half lotus, I think it was, with a MAGA, Make America Great hat on his knee. This was 2016. And a Celtic cross behind him, often used by fascists as a symbol, although not originally. And I suddenly thought, oh no, there's all these charlatans in yoga and all this nonsense spoken, but actually maybe there's a load of fascists. It's very obvious if you think about the very hierarchical relationship between the kind of guru and the cello. I was aware of BJP, right-wing Hindu nationalist party, the governing party in India at the moment. So I was aware of things there, but once I saw an American fascist described, oh, this is odd, he's into yoga, but also he's into tarot and astrology and whatever else, and I thought, hang on a minute.
One of the early reasons that yoga in the West was connected to fascism was that Nazism saw itself as representing a mythological Aryan race. Once you start to examine the idea of the Aryan race closely, it falls apart very quickly. But nevertheless, the fascist argument was that the putative race of Aryans were distinct from the Jewish races of the Bible. The evidence for this rested heavily on the linguistic similarities of Sanskrit, a classical language of ancient India and Iran, to Gothic, Greek and Latin. By this tortuous logic, it was established that the Brahmin class, protected for centuries from miscegenation by the caste system and frequently depicted as having pale skin, were related to Aryans of the north, and therefore that the technique of Hatha Yoga was common heritage of these superior peoples.
So then I started looking specifically for material about fascist yoga. It wasn't hard to come across figures like Francis Yates Brown, who wrote the Bengal Lancer, so he was kind of on the edge of my field of knowledge, or JFG Fuller, who was a disciple of Crowley, so again was on the periphery of my radar. Fuller was a paid-up member of the British Union of Fascists. Crowley, I don't think is politically a fascist, although some people describe him as a fascist. I think that's a bit of a stretch, but Crowley is another key figure in the introduction of some of those ideas into the West.
I asked Home if he could define fascism.
As an ideology, it's generally nationalistic, it's about authoritarian leadership, and it's about creating a closed society. Has a mythological idea of its unity, and that is against foreign influences. It's also generally anti-Semitic, but it doesn't have to be. It can switch over into Islamophobia, it can prioritise that.
What do you mean by a closed society?
A society, well, anti-immigrant, a society that is supposedly based on traditional values.
How does that square with the closed society idea, in that the West has opened itself to these influences?
Precisely because you configure the invaders of the blonde invaders of the Indus Valley as Aryans, and you say that this is the original Aryan culture. I mean, fascism doesn't make ideological sense. It offers false solutions to real problems, and so if you argue that yoga was developed 5,000 years ago by Aryans, who then imposed the caste system to maintain racial stratification, you can believe, although it's ridiculous, that yoga is an Aryan practice and you can practice it as an Aryan.
The 15th century text, the Hatha Yoga Pradipika, only lists 15 fixed postures, of which a full 7 are various cross-legged style seating postures. This bears little resemblance to the hundreds of contortions and sequences of asanas of modern yoga. In their book, Roots of Yoga, James Mallinson and Mark Singleton describe how these postures differed from today's poses, which are conceived to promote physical and mental health. Rather, the earlier postures were designed as forms of mortification, in which the body is an obstacle or a mere irrelevance within the broader soteriological framework of liberation from cyclic existence. Where did this new wave of yoga hail from?
Academics like Mark Singleton in books like Yoga Body, he talks about modern postural practice, which he separates out from when you find references to yoga thousands of years ago. He sees that as describing something else. What was developed in India in the 1920s and 1930s as modern postural practice is massively influenced and draws upon Western gymnastics, particularly Scandinavian primitive gymnastics.
What is now referred to as yoga only goes back a century. It's a mix of elements of the traditional ancient Hatha Yoga and, as Home points out, owes a large debt to the system of Scandinavian primitive gymnastics developed by Niels Book. Book's system had become part of the British Army's training drills in 1906, by which means, along with Germany's physical culture, it was introduced to India and quickly took root. But Home thinks that pioneering American yogi Pierre Bernard may have created the fusion earlier.
That's what Singleton argues, but what I think is interesting is if you go back to Bernard, that you see that fusion happening certainly 10 and possibly 15 or 20 years earlier than in India. So then the question becomes where, what is Bernard the source for this? Did these things develop separately, and where did Bernard's yoga come from?
After visiting what was once called Insight House, from where, beginning in 1948, James Lee Richardson ran the Insight School of Yoga and the Insight Institute courses, we walked half an hour to Lee Richardson's second headquarters, Manor House in Worcester Park, where he moved in 1954.
So he had the mail order occult courses. We talked about the tarot, the palmistry, astrology. There's a whole series of occult development courses, and then the yoga course was also tied into occult development. He was a real hustler and a businessman, so he started as a journalist, writing about spiritualism, the occult, editing in those subject areas, and that was always one of his big interests. But then he turned into a publisher himself by 1954, from this address, he was publishing a British edition of Fate magazine, which was originally an American title, but he took the British franchise, His Health. He was publishing loads and loads of different comics, so he had all these comics, football-based, sports-based, kind of heroic figures, and the promotion for that stressed their Britishness, that they were wholesome British stories, drawn by British artists, written by British writers, and published by Lee Richards himself, presumably British. So one of the interesting things we've found from coming to these two addresses is that both his businesses were right next to churches. People into that kind of thing often think that churches are built originally pagan sites.
So in fascist yoga, a lot of the historical emphasis cuts off at what sort of year do you use as your research stop?
Well, in terms of explicitly fascist yoga, I see it as something that ends with the military defeat on any major scale of the Axis powers, the Nazis, Italian fascism, obviously. So up to 1945.
How do you see these clearly fascist impulses carrying on into the modern day?
I think I sum that up by talking about anti-empiricism and essentialism, which is something that characterises yoga, a lot of the counterculture. It doesn't have to take you into being a fascist, because if you have an essentially irrational belief system, you might go anywhere. But it does open people up to conspiracy theories, anti-vax, whatever else. My argument is that in the main, while there were some people who carried on with an explicitly fascist yoga in the post-war period, Julius Evola, Savitri Devi, or Ezra Pound, who I was just talking about, the majority of people drop any explicit fascist references. What I'm saying is the irrationalism, the anti-empiricism and the essentialism, what I feel is true, and not with an unwillingness to take on board other takes on something and look at scientific evidence. That enables the yoga to flip back out into fascist, which is what we saw happening running up to the pandemic, but even more explicitly through the pandemic and post-pandemic, with a lot of anti-vax conspiracy theorising and then yoga influences. Not all of them, but some of them.
Hatha Yoga did have some conduits directly into the counterculture. Vishnudevananda gave a copy of his complete illustrated book of yoga to George Harrison of the Beatles on the set of Help. Satchidananda, who calmed the crowds at the opening of the Woodstock Festival, was a student of Hatha Yogi Shivananda. Along with B.K. Iyengar, student of Krishnamacharya, these three brought Hatha Yoga to the West in the same way that Maharishi Yogi, Prabhupada and Osho were among those who brought meditation to the West. However, I never found much evidence of enthusiasm towards Hatha Yoga from the hippies. Hatha Yoga seems to take root far more effectively in straight society, as is documented in then contemporary books like Jess Stern's Yoga, Youth and Reincarnation. Hatha Yoga's slow adoption by the psychedelic generation squares with Stewart Home's depiction of it in fascist yoga as somehow, in its anti-authentic state, a tool of the closed rather than open society. But curious, I asked Home whether he at least thought that these seemingly authentic figures, such as Iyengar and Vishnudevananda from the subcontinent, were at least more effective salesmen of Hatha Yoga than Westerners.
I don't know, actually, because if you want to go back and look at Lee Richardson, he did a lot to spread it around the world. We also talked about Francis Yates Brown. If you look at Richard Hittelman with his Yoga for Health TV program, I mean, that was how I came across yoga as a kid and what I associated yoga with, an American salesman, essentially. But yeah, the Indian subcontinent gurus were also very good salesmen of what they did, and it possibly appealed at a particular moment because you could feel like you were getting into something that opposed colonialism, which, as you know, someone from a kind of overdeveloped part of the world, you might feel bad about if you're a hippie.
Are you open to the positive aspects that have come through yoga, the things that yoga's given society?
It's not just the hierarchical nature of yoga that bothers me. I mean, as I said before, I'm actually concerned that the kind of backbending is unhealthy. I read sports science and I'm very interested in, and have been for years, in forms of exercise, different forms of exercise. And I think if people want to do something that's maybe a little like yoga but doesn't emphasize the flexibility as much, from the point of view of safety, it's easy to say, well, go and do some, Pilates or something, and you just won't get the same occult, I'm going to balance your chakras in the class today,